Hi everybody, welcome to my talk today on Lewin's change management model, and I'll be explaining this model using two examples from nursing practice. So the session's aimed at any healthcare students on quality improvement and change management modules. If you find this video helpful, do give me a thumbs up and do check out the other free videos on my YouTube channel, and I have a whole playlist on quality improvement and change management, so I hope you find them useful. So before we look at Lewin's model, I thought it would be helpful to very briefly look at an overview of quality improvement tools and what their main purpose and aims are, the differences between them. So firstly, we have tools that aim to measure care, and such as audit, so you're measuring care against an agreed standard. Other tools aim to understand the cause of the problem. So an example would be a root cause analysis. And root cause analysis aims to find out what happened and why, so that we can make required changes. And an example would be to determine the cause of an adverse event in healthcare after an incident. Then we have tools that help plan and test an improvement, such as the Plan, Do, Study, Act, Cycle and Model of Quality Improvement. And then we have tools that promote change in practice, such as decision trees. And a decision tree is a decision support tool that uses a tree to visualize different decision-making actions and potential outcomes. A good resource is from the Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership, and they have produced a document, a guide to quality improvement tools, and there's a really simple overviews of quality improvement tools which you may find useful. So moving on to Lewin's change management model. Change management models describe and simplify the process when managing and implementing a change in practice. So change management models will increase understanding, and they also help structure the plans to avoid errors. Lewin's 1947 three-step change management model for understanding organisational change is the earliest and most widely recognised, and Lewin's model is underpinned by force field theory, where we have these two forces, resisting or driving forces that influence change. Resisting will restrain, it will hinder and drive people away from change, whereas a driving force will positively influence the change and drive people towards change. So just before I practically apply some examples to Lewin's model, I have 4 videos on my YouTube channel that if any of you are doing assignments you might find helpful. What is the difference between research, quality improvement, service evaluation and audit? Then I have quality improvement, quality assurance, an overview of key terms, and in all my videos I've got reference lists and some helpful resources on all of these topics. The Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle is explained using an example quality improvement project, and a video on service evaluations in healthcare explained using examples from practice. So I hope you find those useful. So Lewin's change management model increases understanding of the change process through a 3-stage process of change. We have the first stage, unfreeze, where we determine the change required and prepare for the change and enable movement. Second stage is change. We take action and implement the change. And then the third stage is the refreeze stage, where we solidify the change. So when practically applying Lewin's model, I thought I'd have a staff example and a patient example. So the first example is a change to staff self-rostering. The second example is a change to patient visiting times that were previously more restricted. When we look at the 3 stages in Lewin's model, the first stage is the unfreeze stage, before a change can be implemented. So it's the preparation stage. And Lewin states that there must be an unfreezing where a status quo may need to be challenged, for example, and assumptions and values are discussed as you prepare for a change. So the unfreeze stage is about preparing for change, and it's a transition phase where you may need to educate others to break the status quo. And you may have people that are quite anxious, individuals anxious about the change. They might say, why do we need this change? We've always done it like this. So individuals can be fearful of change and resist change, and organisational structures and resources need to be prepared. So looking at practically applying this model, how are we going to unfreeze and prepare for change? So having been on many quality improvement projects and implementing change over the years. I say there's three key areas you need to think about. The first is changing or reinforcing people's perceptions, because some people might be very amenable to the change and others may not. So you're looking at what perceptions they have about the change, the assumptions, the belief and their values, and you're aiming to win over staff's heart and minds, otherwise it will not be successful. The second is effective communication and buy-in from key stakeholders. So you need to have a clear justification for the change. How is it going to benefit them? And you need to communicate a clear plan. It might be helpful to pilot or trial the change so you can listen and tweak and adapt, and the staff feel part of that change and connected to the change. And the third is to have an evidence-based decision. So staff need to know that it's justified and there's a reason for this change, and using evidence. So it could be a needs analysis, you might collect data to support the change. They may be helpful to have service user feedback, service evaluations or review research. So for example, looking at the pros and cons of staff rostering, self-rostering, looking at what the research says. So if we think about these areas linked to the two examples that I gave. So when we're looking at change reinforcing people's perceptions, so how are we going to find out about people's perceptions? So the first one's looking at staff perceptions on self-rostering. So we need to establish what the barriers and the facilitators of change are through knowing what their perceptions are. And staff perceptions could be examined in a ward meeting, you could use email communication, provide a survey, one-to-one meetings, or a poster in a staff room where staff can anonymously put up their views. Looking at patient or visitor perceptions linked to changes to visiting times. Similarly, you can use the same data collection methods, survey, feedback, face-to-face, ask them. You might utilise the roles of ward clerk or ward housekeepers to give out some surveys and to collate some data. Looking at the second area, effective communication and buy-in. It also links to the first area, that you have to have good communication and justify the change. How is it going to benefit them? Who are your key stakeholders to implementing this change? So if you're going to change staff rotas and look at changing the system for self-rostering, you don't just focus on registered nurses, it's about support workers or nursing assistants too. If you're looking at visiting times, you also need to involve as well as patients, visitors and carers, and ask them how they feel about the preparation and planning and about the goals that you have. So you also need to have clear timelines. When is the change or rotas or visiting times going to be implemented? And how is the change going to affect these individuals? That needs to be clearly communicated to gain their buy-in. And you need to listen to individual concerns and acknowledge them and allay those fears through, say, for example, a pilot or trialing the change. You can say we're going to try it for a set period and we're going to take on board people's views and evaluate whether it works or not. And that's a great way to say that we've listened to staff and we're going to evaluate. The third area, evidence-based decisions. You're more likely to influence individuals if you've got some data and gained some evidence through needs analysis, or you might want to look at incident reports or complaint from relatives on visiting times, for example, and feedback from patient surveys, friends and families surveys, that would help influence the change to open up the visiting time more. And then service user feedback, service evaluation, and as I said, looking at the pros and cons of self-rostering, and staff need to know that they've got control over the change, have some control over the change, and it promotes fairness and it promotes positive team working by involving service users. So during the unfreezing stage and the other two stages of Lewin's model, you're going to be using key leadership skills, decision-making skills. And if you've got assignments in this area, I've got some great references on both of those videos that you might find helpful as well. So the second part of Lewin's model is to make the change, implement the change. There needs to be leads, champions to monitor progress and concerns, and you aim for a flexible approach where processes can be refined and tweaked to suit the needs of individuals and the team as you go along. So the team needs to feel connected to that change. It's not just the preparation stage, during an implementation and after, those connections and communications need to carry on. you aim to try to meet aims, objectives, timelines to demonstrate progress. But if something happens, so for example, you had somebody set up to write some guidance on self-rostering and they went off sick, you'd need to revise those timelines, which is fine as long as you communicate that to everybody. So people need to understand the change and connect to it and have this continuous line of communication, and clear and often works, and listening and acting on feedback. So because if you don't, what happens is people will revert back to how it was prior to the change. So the final stage, refreeze, this is the part where we're solidifying the change, embedding the change in practice and reinforcing. And it's one of the most important stages not to neglect. You could have implemented this fantastic change in practice, but if you don't embed the change in practice, you don't monitor, you don't evaluate long term, people will revert back to old ways often. So identifying change champions would be helpful in both those examples that I gave to monitor longer term change. So you can have leads, but also you need people on the ground that are champions of the change, that can collect data and monitor when the leads aren't there. So collecting regular feedback is very important, and addressing any barriers to change and establishing anything that's hindering change or what's supporting the change. So an example might be gaining some positive feedback from patients and staff. You might look at incident reports and complaints. In relation to self-rostering, offering training, support and guidance, you could have a pack and some information for all staff on how to implement self-rostering, and have some link nurses that are champions of self-rostering to help teach others how to use the system to self-roster. The big barrier there would be enabler, would be staff using the self-rostering system, and if staff feel they can't use it, they don't get taught on it, that it's not going to happen. So that would be a big thing to be working on for communication. And similarly with the visiting times, it would be communicating on posters the changes to visiting times to prevent confusion at the door when relatives and carers are there. And so it's communication, those areas that I talked about earlier, communication and evidence base, having your evidence is very important for the refreeze stage as well. And then communicating and celebrating success helps to increase understanding, knowledge about the change, and just it prevents people reverting back. It highlights the change again. So you can do that through posters, you can do it in team meetings, minute it, newsletters. It might be such a good change that you want to share it with others across an employer. You might want to publish as well, a fantastic way of sharing your work, and that all helps. So I hope you found this talk helpful. There's some great references here for Lewin and the guide to quality improvement tools, and also some very helpful websites. Look out for your quality improvement hubs and local quality improvement leads that will help you with change management and quality improvement projects. And if you do want to ask any questions, put them in the YouTube channel. If you prefer to ask me questions privately, you can DM me on Twitter or on my website. And I wish you every success if you are implementing change and using Lewin's model, or if you have assignments where you're using Lewin's model.